All right, we're going to go ahead and begin. So thank you so much for coming to this presentation today. I definitely appreciate your presence here, given that it is a very unusual and challenging time right now. With the COVID-19 pandemic, I know that most of us are working from home. Some of us have been furloughed, unemployed, or facing that precarious unemployment situation. And so this webinar and why I've put it together is to help all of us collectively learn how to better capture and communicate the value of our collection work and hopefully sort of help to secure our employment positions at our respective institutions. Let me go ahead and admit these couple other people before I go on. One downside to a super secure meeting. All right. So thank you everyone for joining this morning. I do want to review some of the different types of job people that we have represented here and the institutions. We've got everything from curators to archivists to librarians, registrars, records managers, cultural property law strategists, catalogers, digitization techs, grant writers, genealogists, historians, and digital asset managers, which is pretty incredible. And I'm really happy to see such a diversity of the collection work because this webinar has really been built to help accommodate every type of collection and collection worker. And of course, that means that it's also different types of agencies. So represented today, we've got corporations, nonprofits, city, state, and federal employees, archives, museums, libraries, and universities. And that's spanning everywhere, coast to coast, including Hawaii and Alaska. And then we also have represented Canada, Holland, Sweden, and England. So thank you so much for everybody for joining. And we will go ahead and get started. Oh, I think I skipped my housekeeping slide. I did. All right. So for housekeeping for the webinar today, you are all muted and you will remain muted. We are going to be doing questions. So thank you for those who submitted their questions in advance. I did try and incorporate as much as I could for the webinar to help account for the questions. There were a couple though that I just didn't have room for or they weren't quite on topic. So if your question's not answered and you submitted one, I will be emailing you later. As questions come up, I will answer all of them at the end, but go ahead and type them into the chat box. We'll use the chat box for questions. I do have someone helping me with questions later today, so they will help capture and record those questions and then help me go through the Q&A at the end. The webinar is being recorded, of course. Because your cameras and audio are off, you will not be captured in this recording, so no need to worry about that. And the recording will be made available and sent out to everyone at the end. And of course, also a copy of the slide deck, because I realize some of the things that might be hard to take all these notes, so don't worry, a slide deck will also be included in that link. Come on, slide. Okay. So for those who are not familiar with me, I'm Rachael Woody, and I am an archivist and museum professional. I have worked at the Smithsonian Institution helping to revive their collections, and I also helped to launch the Oregon Wine History Archive at Linfield College. So I'm familiar with either crafting programs from scratch or trying to revive programs and innovate and evolve them. And as a result of this type of work, many of the positions were precariously funded. So much of what I'm presenting here today has been based on my own personal experience and strategies. And while at the Smithsonian Institution, at first, because they didn't have an archivist for that particular museum for quite a while, it had to be a term position before it could be a permanent on budget position. And then for the Oregon Wine History Archive, it was a brand new program. The position wasn't on budget. It was kind of cobbled together funding wise. And so in both of those positions, I had to work with everyone to help advocate, educate people on what the value of collections work was, what the value of having me as a collection worker was. And so we'll be going through everything that I talk about today is things that I've had to use for myself to advocate for my position and my work. And then I've also used with my clients to help them do the same thing. And because of that, of course, I've had 10 years plus of experience in grant acquisition strategy and donor cultivation, which of course can be a piece of this, and have since gone on to be a consultant for cultural heritage organizations, archives, libraries, and museums. So before we begin, I do want to say that I am not an economist. I am not an expert in pandemics or in the economy. I am an expert, though, in collection work and how to advocate for that collection work. So just so you know, that I can only speak to my particular experience, and we are currently in a very unprecedented time. And so many of the strategies that I have here are evergreen. We should be using this sort of advocacy work all of the time. But I do realize that this is an unusual time, and so I hope that these strategies we can adapt to help each other out. But just know that there's an asterisk next to this in terms of, because none of us have been through this type of challenge before, we're going to have to test out an experiment to see what's the most effective. All right, sorry, I've got one more person. Let me let them in. Okay, so this particular webinar is sort of like a part two. Many of you saw the first webinar last month with the title Deriving Value from Collections in the Time of Corona. And I gave that webinar with Chris Cummings, who's the founder and CEO of Pass It Down, and Margot Note, a fellow consultant. She's the owner and principal of Margot Note Consulting. So there's the YouTube link down below. It's publicly available. So for those of you who have not caught it before, I encourage you to take a look. Come on, slides. Okay. So our objectives for today, we're building off of that first webinar, and I'm really going to focus and build out and expand what we were talking about in terms of how to capture and communicate your value. So the objectives for today, I do want to do a review of income streams, because knowing where our money is coming from is really important. And then knowing how our work ties into bringing that money in is just as important. So we're going to cover that as sort of an overview and foundation. We're then going to talk about how to define our value. While we do cover revenue streams and how we can support those directly, so much of our work is indirectly supporting the revenue streams. And so sometimes we need to learn how to talk about and define our value in a different non-revenue type way. So we're going to dig into what that looks like. And then, of course, the key parts here, the capturing the value and communicating that value, which is so necessary in order to advocate for our positions and our collections. So getting into it, we've got income streams. And these income streams, the classifications that I used are based on the American System for Accounting and Taxation. And while they are not perfect or all-encompassing, they are typically what we find in our organizations. So we're looking at earned income, so any sort of direct revenue coming in, membership, special events, etc. We've got charitable income, which can be grants and donors, government funding, which is grants, levies, bonds, line items. And if you are in a government position, which some of you are, that of course takes a little bit of a different meaning. And then there's the financial capital, so any sort of endowments, capital assets, etc. And while everybody is a bit different, I did want to give you an example of, for the museum sector at least, according to the American Alliance of Museums, they did a leadership survey in 2017, which analyzed these four tax brackets to see how much of each went into an average museum budget. And so for them, they found that earned income and charitable income were about even with 33% each. And that government funding was 19%, and then capital investments was 11%. With a quick note here that due to AAM's rounding, this does not equal 100%, which of course you can check out the report for more details. So in thinking about this, while this is not true for everyone, I do need you to be familiar with what your income streams are and get to know what those percentages are. They will vary on year, they will vary by agency, or even different types of organizations, museums, archives, etc. So the task is to get to know where your money is coming from. Oh, and that image is not working apparently. But to learn more, check out the American Alliance of Museums Trend Watch 2020 report. The title of that one is The Future of Financial Sustainability, with the link there. And of course, you're getting a copy of the slides, so you don't need to furiously jot it down. But they do a great job of breaking down the different financial streams, what's worked in the past, what might work in the future. Of course, the caveat there is that this was written and gathered pre-COVID-19. And so AAM has done a lot of work after the report has come out to help retroactively address what we can do next moving forward. So while the Trends Watch report is there, and I invite you to look at it, they also have additional supplemental webinars, podcast lectures that you can check out. So our first question when we're looking at these income streams is, how do we in our work support them? And for our purposes today, for much of our work, we're only going to be looking at 3 out of the 4, and that's earned income, charitable income, and government funding. And the task here is to identify our work that leads to a revenue generating event. And so what those can look like, I've sort of broken down here. For earned income, a revenue generating event would be someone who buys a museum membership or a special libraries membership. It could be tuition to the university. It could be retail if you have a shop in-house. Special events attendance, lecture attendance, anything where there's that exchange and that there's that revenue generating event. For charitable income, this looks differently, of course. There's the grant awards that you win. There's also the donors that come in and provide money, whether that's one time or through special larger gifts or funding. And then for government funding, that can also be grants at the state, local, or federal level. And then for some of us, the organizations get funded through bonds, levies, or different line items. So we're looking at, with all of those, there's some sort of money exchange. Something is provided in exchange for something, and that is a revenue generating event. And so our task here is thinking about collection work and how they relate to those events. So the action is to make a connection. I want you to try and identify for your organization what your revenue generating events are. So thinking about them broadly at first, what is all the revenue that's coming in? And then map out how your work supports each. For some of us, it can be very direct. For example, if you're a curator, you curate an exhibit, it goes up. That's what helps to generate the museum membership and attendance. That's a very direct connection of the dots there in terms of how your collection work helps to bring in that revenue. For some of us, it's a little bit more indirect. And so thinking about how our work helps to support that revenue generating event can have a little bit more dots in it. And so thinking about how the work that we do will eventually lead to garnering that revenue generating event. And we'll go over some examples in a minute. And then that last piece, of course, is brainstorming how you can adapt your work to better support these revenue events. So whether that is more robustly supporting a revenue event or trying to add on and support different ones, it's time to get creative, especially with the current challenge that we're dealing with. So here's some examples for the more indirect ways that we are supporting the revenue generating events. The first one is, there's an archivist, and they're supporting the university celebrating its sesquicentennial. And so the archivist has gone through the collection, has done some of the initial research and work, pulling out interesting items. All of that is then digitized, sent to marketing, used for invitations. A display has gone up. There's special events around the sesquicentennial. Like, all of the collection work and the work that the archivist is doing is being used in so many different ways to generate interest in the celebration of the sesquicentennial, the special events, the special campaign going on for fundraising. And so while the university, for some of the higher ups, may not see the archivist as directly generating revenue from that particular set of events in this case, the work they're doing is so critical for the sesquicentennial to be successful. Because if you're not creating those relationship ties or honoring those ties with the collection at the university, it's going to not be as interesting or engaging for that community. So this is an instance where it might be indirect collection work, but it does have ties to those revenue generating events. Another example here is a registrar or archivist cataloging collections in a collection management system, a CMS. And so that then is published online. That's what people Google or land on your website for. They start to look at the collections, they get interested, they decide to come visit or do research, or perhaps make a donation because you have the type of collection they like to view and support. And so this is an instance where the registrar or the archivist, in doing that work, the cataloging piece, doesn't necessarily immediately generate the revenue, but they are helping to support generating interest for the revenue generating events like admissions, membership, donors. And then last example here, if you're an educator, librarian, or archivist supporting curriculum development, using the collections, developing those educational models, making them available for students, bringing classes in, all help to generate interest in the collection, engaging the community. For some of our organizations, they've been able to help tap into educational funds at the city levels, or even grants that help to support curriculum development with the collections. And so in creating those educational models and serving students, they are eventually leading to getting money for that work and having that revenue generated. So hopefully that helps give you some ideas of, while the work not may be directly in exchange for revenue, it does, as you map it out and connect those dots, it does support revenue coming into your organization. So then our next question is, but what if our work can't be directly tied to revenue generating events? Because again, so much of our work, it can seem custodial, the collections care and management and sharing of it. And so thinking about, if we can't speak in terms of revenue or generating revenue, how else can we define our value here? Which is where we're getting into how to define the value of your work. So my question for us in this section is, what do these have in common? So coming back to the income streams for a moment, looking at them to see what is in common here. For earned income, if we're looking at membership, tuition, retail, attendance, special events, all of those types of events are engaging the community. So the community coming in to get membership, attending the college, shopping there, attending a special event at the archives. Those are all community engaging with the organization. For charitable income with grants and donors, if you're getting a grant, it's usually to provide something that the community will then use. Similarly with donors, they like to fund projects that have a broad community impact. So a lot of the charitable income is to help support those community engagement events. And similarly with government funding, grants similar to the charitable income, and then looking at the bonds and levies, those are specifically for supporting the community to come in and engage with your collections. For example, if you're a historical society and the county that you're in passed a bond to help supplement your income, perhaps in exchange for that, membership in that county is free, so they can freely attend your museum. So it's a way to engage your community there. So what do those have in common? They all require community engagement. And so when we're thinking of value, especially when we're not talking in direct dollar terms, we need to start defining that as our value is the way we engage our community. Because engaging the community, as you saw in that previous slide, helps support and entice our income streams. And so community engagement with both the direct and indirect ties to our income streams, we need to make sure that they are healthy, because the healthier our organization's engagement is, the healthier our income streams will be. So then the next question is, how does collection work support engagement? And so our action item here is identifying our points of engagement and learning how to articulate their value. When we're thinking physical engagement, and of course I realize that that is not possible right now, but it will hopefully be again in the future. Physical engagement items are when people come in to view the exhibitions or displays. They come in to research or browse the collections. They are coming to the organization to attend classes, lectures, special events where the collections help to fuel that content. or they're coming and they're having conversations, whether with each other while viewing the collection or with yourself as a collection worker. And for some of us, it's also just to be there and to commune with the collections, which is in itself an engagement with collections and indirectly our work. And when thinking about those points of engagement, what is the value being derived? So the result of seeing the exhibitions, attending the classes, engaging with people, these are the values. They're seeing, reading, listening, and learning about our collections and our work. They're receiving education or inspiration as they are interacting with the collections. They are within our space, sometimes for respite and rejuvenation. And then, of course, they're here for connection, whether it's connection with us, whether it's connection with the collections, or with each other. And then, of course, thinking about our digital engagement, even pre-COVID-19, a lot of our engagement we were already doing digitally, which has only become more important or has received more focus as a result of many of our places being physically closed. So when we think of digital engagement, our points of engagement are digital displays through the collections management system or the website. We have collections online through the CMS or the website. We have articles and blog posts, either we wrote them or someone wrote them on our collections. And then, of course, all of the collections that have helped fuel content such as lectures, webinars, tours, behind the scenes, live streams, Q&As, etc. All of this great content we've seen in the last couple of months, sort of, it was done before, but I think it's been even more heightened and focused on since we've been all working virtually. And of course, the fun ones that have come out of this that Chris and Margot covered in our previous webinar, fun things like games, puzzles, and educational projects, just to be able to use the collection in a way that is educational, but also enjoyable. And then, of course, anything that we're doing on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, YouTube, any of those that help to get the collection content out there and that speaks to our work. So thinking about those points of engagement, we're then thinking about how can we define the value derived from digital engagement. And so the result of that digital engagement is that the community is seeing, reading, listening, and learning about our content, about our collections. They are receiving education and inspiration from the content we're providing through our collection. They, in a digital form, are getting some sort of respite and rejuvenation, especially right now. And they're getting connection with the collections, with ourselves, with each other, being able to engage with the collections there. And so you'll notice here that the value that our community stakeholders derive from both the physical and digital engagement, they are the same. So even though I know some of us are feeling this sort of cognitive dissonance with physical work versus digital work, really when we're thinking about our points of engagement with our work and the value that our community is getting from that, the value is the same. And so I encourage you to think about that some more. Pausing for water. Okay. So getting into the good stuff now, I've got some strategies and formulas to help us learn how to capture the value of our work here. Starting with the question, how can we find evidence of value? So thinking about those points of engagement, and especially right now when it's a lot of digital engagement, how can we capture our evidence? What is the evidence of our value? So our action item here is we need to capture the quantitative and the qualitative information from engagement activities and then analyze that work to extract evidence of value derived. And before we go much deeper, as a refresher, quantitative is numbers-based, so any sort of evidence that is quantifiable by numbers. And then qualitative is a narrative or descriptive format, speaking directly to the quality that can't be defined by numbers. Getting into it then, capturing that digital engagement. And so the engagement elements we should think of here is checking out the various dashboards that we have. So your website, your collections management system, even your social media channels will have some form of statistical dashboard where you can get some of these numbers. And if they're not set up yet, or if you don't have access to them at your organization, I highly recommend that you get that access or work with someone who does have that access. And if it's not set up yet, please set it up because it will be very helpful for you in doing this work. Excuse me. So digging into that, we're going to take a look at the visitor numbers. And what I want you to look at is both the repeated and the unique. Sorry, excuse me. A lot of talking lately. Looking at visitor numbers, repeated and unique. So repeated can sometimes show us that that's a community member that is loyal, that is perhaps local, that is very engaged with your museum or organization and your content. And then the unique visitor might be somebody who is new to the area, or they're looking to visit there once we can visit places again. And so looking to get to know your organization and collection. The next item I want us to look at is clicks and duration. So what are they clicking on? How long are they spending there? That is a huge indicator to you in terms of what collection types are valuable, what is the most interesting to people right now, what is in demand, which can help indicate to you what is working and what people want more of. And similarly, take a look at the increase numbers. So was there an increase in visitors? Was there an increase in page views on particular pages? And was there an increase in duration of time spent on those pages? Because that helps to show you a new trend that is emerging, some of it which of course can be situational, such as the one we're in terms of what people are looking at and what is needed right now. The next one to focus on is more of the qualitative. So looking at comments, discussions, questions, insights, any sort of narrative feedback that is given to you, whether that can be captured by your CMS or website form, or of course, more commonly is usually your social media channels. Another couple of things to take a look out for is any attention you're getting from outside audiences. For example, if your organization was most recently highlighted in like a professional organization or the local news, what you're doing in this current situation, for example, pointing to and capturing where that attention is coming from and what it's delivering is also very valuable. And then of course, follows, likes, and shares, subscriptions, any sort of commitment that our digital community is giving us by committing to following and liking and sharing our content. So getting into what to capture, first thing up is statistics. So that's the quantitative information that we need. So for every online venue, website, CMS, social channels that track engagements, all of the quantitative of the list I gave you earlier in the previous slide, we need those statistics. The second part is the stories, so the qualitative, the narrative description, gathering anecdotes, notes of gratitude, any sort of questions or insights or things that you've received from people in a text format versus a number format that helps to show interest and helps to validate the value that you're giving your community. And I want you to take those two elements and do analysis. So again, thinking about what's getting attention, what's being used, what could we do more of? And the bonus here is that if you have been tracking information prior to COVID-19, it would be very interesting to compare and contrast what was happening before and what is happening now. So if you have that sort of comparison, that can be also very interesting and informative for your higher ups to take a look at. So we've thought about how to define our value. We've talked about some strategies for how to capture that value. Now we're going to talk about how to communicate the value of your work. And the first part, of course, is translating. So our action here is to translate the engagement and the numbers and the qualitative data that we have captured and put them into value statements. And this is admittedly, I think, the hardest part for a lot of the people that I work with. So I have an equation, which may or may not be helpful for your brain, but taking a look at, we did X action, it provided Y value, that Z numbers of our community to insert verb. So an example here is we live streamed a talk on one of the items in our collection, and it provided a learning opportunity that 1,500 of our community members have viewed and enjoyed. So live streamed talk, that's our X action. And then learning opportunity, that is the Y value. They received learning and perhaps some enjoyment. And then the Z numbers of our community, so 1,500, which we got from our dashboard. And then of course the verbs at the end, people viewed and enjoyed that content. So as you're gathering and crunching the numbers and crunching the qualitative data, start learning and practicing how to take some of that evidence and translate it into a value statement. Many of our bosses and higher ups, sometimes numbers speak the most to them, sometimes an example speaks the most to them, but being able to provide both will help you account for both sides of whatever type of left or right brain person you're talking with. So that's why I'm having you use both and having you make such a clear value statement. And the next step is packaging your message. So capturing the evidence, learning how to make those value statements is great, but we then need to do the extra step of learning how to package it appropriately. So our action here is we need to package our value statements to be audience appropriate. And when I'm talking about packaging, the examples here are reports, whether that's department, annual report, donor report, alumni report, emails, formal and informal, infographics, which can be a great way to provide information in a very visual way. Presentations, whether that's to internal or external stakeholders, blog posts, articles, and of course, press releases. And then the next question for us to think about is, who are you communicating with and what do they need to know? So who are your various audiences and what information needs to go where and in what type of packaging that would be most effective? And of course, we are all in different types of organization situations, and we're all trying to communicate the different activities that we're doing. So this is definitely, I'll provide some examples, but this is for you to take and think about and adjust for your own needs. So the stakeholders I do want to focus on today, though, given the situation and given that a lot of our organizations are struggling financially, I know that a lot of us have either already lost our jobs or we feel that our employment is precarious. And so this is why I do want to spend some time focusing on how to talk to your boss, how to talk to your boss's boss or board or whoever it is, director, dean that is above, and also your peers, because having your peers understand and respect and value what you do could be very critical to helping you remain a part of your institution. Because if you're not in the room where it happens, it could be that one of your peers are. And so having them know and understand what you do could be very critical here. And then of course, thinking about the external stakeholders, we also want to make sure that we're talking to our community. We are communicating with granting agencies and donors, and of course, whatever our government locality looks like, as our charitable and government income can come from those sectors as well. So here's some examples. If we're looking at internal stakeholders and thinking about your boss specifically, I realize we have different communication styles and there may be restrictions that you are dealing with in terms of whether or not you are allowed to communicate and in what forum. So I do want to acknowledge that there can be some challenges there, but hopefully some of these you can take and use, and either using the formal or informal channels. I believe at least some of these examples should be helpful. So thinking about your boss, any sort of weekly email update, quick check-in, maybe you're having a weekly meeting, any sort of meeting where you check in and the point of that meeting is to talk about your work. And while it may be more project focused, I also want you to include a value anecdote. So whether that's about a patron served, an item found, a new item acquired, you hit a project milestone, or lessons learned even, any sort of communication to your boss that shows that you are working, you're focusing on mission, you're focusing on how to serve your community, and that you're doing great work, essentially. When thinking about your boss's boss or board or whoever that higher up is, while it can be somewhat difficult to communicate with them directly, I do encourage you to reach out informally if not allowed to do so formally. And by doing that, sharing just a big win, even if for them it may not seem like a big win, if it's a big win for you, that still counts. Sharing that big win, sharing a grant won or a project completed, just something that is good news that you can share with them informally, trust me, they are going to be happy to hear it. I don't think they're going to be upset. So communicating to them that you're bringing in these big wins, that you're bringing this value, having that being sent up the chain of command essentially is very important. And I know for many of us, we have had bosses where they have not supported us. And so some of that information doesn't necessarily make it through your boss, which is why I'm encouraging you to informally reach out and up. And then for both of these, of course, there's annual reports or any sort of reporting mechanism that you might have for your organization, making sure that within that report, you're clearly tying how your work is supporting the income streams for your organization. So again, thinking to the beginning of the webinar and learning what your income streams are. And then of course, how the work that you're doing is meeting the organization's mission. The more you can point back to your mission, your strategic plan, whatever core values, whatever sort of languaging your organization uses, as much as you can tie your work to that, because that helps to show that it is very critical work that you're doing, that it's very appropriate, and that it's not something that could be easily cut. And as a tip here, again, thinking about different ways people process information, I recommend having an infographic with your report. You could have like a 20, 30-page report, but then have like a one-page infographic with the highlights, like what's the takeaway here, so that you know they're at least getting a couple items that you want them to retain in terms of the value of your work. Pausing for more water. And then to continue the internal stakeholder examples, thinking about your peers. So depending on what sort of communication is common for your organization, some email, Slack, sometimes Zoom meetings as we are living in right now, any sort of communication you can do formally or informally, and just to shoot them like an item of the week or like a Friday from the archives, or share like a aha moment, a cool engagement stat or anecdote, anything that can help bring some levity, bring some good news, bring some interest in the work that you are doing, and sort of subtly help educate and provide that outreach moment to your peers who may not necessarily understand the work that you're doing and the value that you're providing. So definitely take the opportunity and reach out to your peers to do some of that work. And then here's my tip. So in thinking about our internal stakeholders, our boss's boss, our peers, I want you to develop a reputation. So always be the person who has a collection story that highlights the value of your work. And you can have that in your back pocket. So if you're in the metaphorical elevator, the virtual elevator right now, or just before a Zoom meeting, any sort of informal gathering situation where you can communicate just a very quick value note about your work. The more you do this, the more you will develop a reputation of not only being a person who has good news, which is a very valuable commodity, but you're also the person who's very enthusiastic and passionate about their work, the person who's always doing new and interesting things. And at some point, because you develop this reputation, people are going to expect this from you and know this of you. And this is a strategy I used both at the Smithsonian and at the Oregon Mine History Archive, where I was able to turn both temporary positions into permanent, fully funded positions. And I think a lot of it was this informal work of just at any opportunity, just having a quick note about the work that I'm doing that can help sort of educate and talk about the value of what I'm bringing to the organization. Then the external stakeholders, which again, knowing about our income streams and how we need to engage our community and how important that is for all of the income streams, we need to also make sure we're communicating with them. So in thinking about our community for our organizations, that could be a newsletter, your blog, your social media channels. And I encourage you to be transparent and share some victories like grants won. Your community may not know or fully understand that the grant project is doing, but they do know that you just brought money into your institution to do cool work, and that is enough for them. So celebrating victories like that, even if you don't think they'll necessarily get it, they'll still appreciate the good news, if you're noticing a theme here. And then also be honest about your challenges. For example, it could be a conservation issue and talking about the work around that, or why we can't digitize everything, put it online and throw it away, an opportunity to talk about that. Or it could be larger, depending on your leeway in terms of what you can communicate. Being honest about the financial difficulties right now, if our community and our donors aren't aware, if our government isn't aware, then they don't know that they need to help us or that there's an opportunity to help us. So we need to make sure we're doing our job by putting that out there. And thinking about and specifically getting into granting agencies and donors and our government, depending on your organization, it could be an annual report, it could be attending the city council meeting, emails, press releases, any sort of mechanism where you can share the statistics of how you're serving the community and demonstrating how you're bringing that value to your community. So then I would like you to rinse and repeat. So thinking about communication, be clear, be concise, be consistent, and be on mission. We were already in an age where we were being inundated with information. And so respecting people's time, especially if we're doing our informal communication strategies, being clear, being concise, but then also being consistent to gain that reputation and being on mission so that while you're doing cool stuff, it is cool stuff that is critical for the mission of your organization versus cool stuff that's expendable. And then I would like to get into some hard truths here before we wrap this up. I know that defining our value, capturing it, communicating it, this can be new content for a lot of us and uncomfortable. And especially with the communication piece, I want to remind you that in this instance, being humble or reserved, while honorable, it is a liability. We are in precarious funding positions, many of us in our organizations, and being humble or reserved is not going to help you in this case. And so I realize that for many of us who are introverted and where this is not comfortable, I appreciate that and I do acknowledge that, but I do think that is something that we need to work through in order to help ourselves. And to get into the next point, that is because no one is going to do it for you. Not even your boss for most of us, unfortunately. So learning how to be your own advocate, learning how to be effective in capturing and communicating the value of your work and your collections is so critical. And for our next point, people who don't know how to do your job won't understand its value unless you tell them and show them and probably tell them again. So make sure that you are communicating, and all the strategies that we covered in this webinar is all in an effort to help provide some education around the work that we do, help to make those connections as to why it's critical work, important, valuable work, so that people around us and who are making those financial decisions are very aware of what we're doing and why it is valuable. And of course, even at the best of times, there's competition for resources. So if you don't ask, you are not going to get. And so learning to be able to quantify your value will then help you be able to make that ask, because you've justified your value, which is going to make that ask easier. And to round out the hard truths here, if you're not on top of mind now, you will not be top of mind when the financial decisions are made. So all of these strategies and this effort for you to communicate your value is so important so that you are top of mind when people are in the room where the decisions are being made and they're having to make some tough choices. So thinking about all of these and integrating them and knowing what you're up against, all of this I hope will help for you to be a better advocate for yourself, your job, and your collections. So to bring this all home so we can have some time for questions, here's what we learned. We learned about our income streams, and we learned how to tie activities to direct revenue events within those income streams. We learned that when it's indirect, we learned that our value is equal to the community engagement we can inspire. We learned to identify points of engagement and how to articulate their value. We learned how to translate our activities into value statements, and we learned how to gather evidence of our value, which of course we then all put together to communicate the value to our stakeholders. And some resources I want to provide to you, again, I'll send out a copy of this slide deck so that you don't have to quickly write these down, but American Alliance of Museums, they have advocacy resource page, which has various toolkits and links and resources. I wrote a blog post on the second bullet that has gathered both AAM and other resources for museums and cultural heritage organizations. And I did similar for the third bullet point, which is Society of American Archivists. On the Archives Aware blog, there is a blog post for resources on how to convey the value of archives, which has gathered resources there. And for a regional example, I'm located in Oregon, and so we have the Oregon Heritage Commission, who have been working really hard on getting us, I believe they have two different toolkits now, a cultural impact toolkit and an economic impact toolkit. So I encourage you, even if you're not in Oregon, to check those out, but also keep in mind what are the resources that are available to you in your region, which may help you to learn how to talk about your value and give you some toolkit items to use. And a quick plug, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, IMLS, just released their CARES Act funding. So the grants are available and open now. This particular apply date is June 12th. They have 13 million, a little bit above actually, to give away. And the award range is anywhere from 25,000 to 500,000. And this is to cover to help cover the operating deficit costs that we're dealing with right now. And it also helps to cover innovative projects, especially given our current situation, some creative solutions or problem solving. So I encourage you to check that out because IMLS funds a variety of people, whether it's libraries, archives, museums, or cultural heritage organizations. They also do fund both nonprofits and depending on which level of the government you are, they can help support you at the government level too. So please check that out. And we're about ready to get into questions. And before we do, I wanted to provide a couple links of where you can find me. Website to learn more about me and my services is on top. If you have any questions that we don't get to today, or if you think of questions later, please feel free to email me with my email there. I'm very active on the various social media, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and post whether I'm doing a webinar there or any sort of resources, I will post there and share so you can follow me there. And then I have a newsletter, which many of you have signed up for, so thank you for that. And I encourage you to do so if these webinars are helpful to you, because I will be offering more of them, and the people who are on the newsletter sign-up list have first dibs, essentially. There was a wait list for this webinar, but if you're on my newsletter, you will get first access. So you'll be first in line. And the next one I'm releasing will be a free mini course on grant writing. So whether you're brand new to grants or in like the intermediate level of grants, it will be a free offering released in the next couple of weeks. So if you sign up, you'll learn more soon. And then of course, the bottom link is a free copy of my ebook. While I realize not all of us work in museum organizations, the book is very much written where the foundational knowledge and strategies used can be applied and adapted to your situation. And it's free e-copy, so grab a copy, let me know what you think, and hopefully it is helpful for you, especially during this time. And with that, I am going to open up the chat box. So I am unmuting Kyle, who has been tracking questions. So I think maybe we just have one question so far.
Yeah, I was just the feedback provided from Grammy was, as an emerging pro, I totally respect the last tip about collection stories, kind of in regards to having that canned success story in your back pocket. You're able to share with your peers,
Yeah.
just kind of tying back into the self-advocating. Try to bolster yourself up. It was a good point.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you for confirming we got it right. Perfect.
Perfect.
What other questions do we have or concerns? And of course, if there's not questions, I will take that as a good sign that I did a good job. Hopefully that's the case. If any of you are free to give feedback, please feel free to email me because I will hopefully be doing more of these. So if I know what's helpful to you, I can make sure I cover it. Oh, and it looks like Lorene, I'm apologizing if I say that wrong. Thank you so much. She says, thank you for an excellent presentation. Thank you. I do appreciate that. When you're putting these things together, you always hope that it is helpful, but it's good to have that validated.
So the first one there from Carrie was, Rachel, have you had experience in situations where self-advocacy is seen by higher ups as being kind of a squeaky wheel rather than a voice that deserves attention? Hoping that was articulated well.
Yes, yeah. Thank you for raising that, Carrie. There will be people that may perceive it as a squeaky wheel. My hope is that most of that for most reasonable people can be avoided because of course most of what you're doing is you're communicating value, so you're talking about your value, you're not making that ask all the time, so that once you do make that ask, you've already communicated your value so much that it just makes sense. So it's a little bit of a nuanced difference in terms of you're talking about your work because you love it, you're doing great work, you're excited about it, and then on the occasion, making sure you're inserting what you need. I do realize right now we're all probably very much in need, and so I appreciate that current predicament. But hopefully, in providing that messaging regularly, the value is what's being taken away. Though I do admit there will always be people who are not happy about your good news or that feel sort of that resource scarcity, and it is a reality, and some people we won't be able to convert to how valuable our work is. So um, I know that was sort of a long and it depends answer, but hopefully that was helpful.
The next question here is from Hillary, and it has to do with I'm curious about strategies for initiating conversations about budgeting and revenue streams when this information isn't readily offered to mid-level staff.
Ah. Yes. So depending on the type of organization you are, sometimes this is common and even public knowledge, in which case, awesome. Sometimes this is stuff that you have to sort of dig out from the annual report that the organization puts out, whether to its board or its foundation. If it is not readily available for you, I would make overtures and reach out to whatever your financial accounting department looks like. um, Ask your boss if you think it'll be helpful, but sometimes it's easier or more helpful to just go to the source and just ask questions. Ask questions so that you can learn more about how the organization is operating and how you can support it. And honestly, because you're coming from a place that you want to support and bring in even more income streams, reasonable people would want to help you with that. And so I do recommend reaching out and asking those questions, and hopefully you will get at least some information to help inform your work. But yes, good question.
The next quick comment here, just to kind of lightly touch on, kind of keeping track of how you're bringing value to the things, to the community at large and the projects you're working on. But from Lisa was kind of a tip that it was helpful to track the amount of staff time and other resources spent on specific engagements, events, kind of
Mhm.
including that in the value that you're writing down.
Yes, thank you for adding that, Lisa. That will help, especially when you do make those asks. You have actually also quantified not just the value, but the labor that has gone into getting that value. So that is also very valuable and is perhaps what we should do the next webinar on, because it will help you make that ask, and you can very easily prove that it did take that work and that it was worth it. I think I had one more thought about that. Oh, and specifically thinking about like the university celebrating its sesquicentennial example, thinking about all of the work that the archivist had to do to support those various things, like because it was such a big event, capturing all of that staff hourly things that went into it, the volunteer time, even how many items were digitized, all of those numbers will help to sort of lobby for like, yes, we did help with generating revenue from celebrating this event, and we also put in a lot of time and costs into it. So that is an example of why it would be such a great way to capture that. So thank you, Lisa.
The next question here is from Ryan, and would you have any comments on how to connect the development or origins of an archives or a collection with current work and initiatives? It seems there are good opportunities to demonstrate value through time with a longer timeline, though it may be a challenge to keep focus and could lose stakeholder interest.
Okay. So connecting development origins of an archives with current work initiatives. So I imagine some specifics may be helpful, and Ryan, I'm happy to talk some more about this offline too, but if I'm understanding correctly, I think I would go back to thinking about the organization mission, and thinking about if you've got strategic plan or whatever it is that your organization is using to help guide its work, tying the development and origins of the archives and collections to that. There's also the opportunity here to talk about legacy. No matter what sort of repository you are, if you are collecting and documenting sort of the origin and timeline of that organization, you can help prove the value of that organization's work over time, which of course helps prove your value in documenting that, and can be very informative. So I would recommend referring to the mission, the strategic plan, what have you, any sort of new initiatives, and tying that to why the collections were started in the first place, what's in the archives now, what the work you're doing is now versus then. Like, there could be some really interesting work here doing a sort of a retrospective of why the collection or the archives, I think in this case, was started, and sort of what it's done over time, and why it is so valuable and what it is doing now. So I hope that helped answer it, but I'm happy to chat more about this offline too. Yes, thank you for validating. All right, I realize that it is noon, and I think we got through the questions that we have so far. So I do want to honor your time and end on time, but please do feel free to email me with questions that you want to follow up on, or if I didn't quite address correctly. And of course, any sort of feedback you have for what worked or what you want to see next, I am happy to take that on board. The work that we do, obviously, I feel very passionate about it. It is such critical work, and all of you as my colleagues are very valuable. So if you don't have jobs, then our organizations are closed, and that also means that I don't have a job. So we're doing this because I want to support you and help you keep your job, but also it is a little self-serving. So I do want to be transparent about that. So please take care. Thank you so much for attending the presentation. I very much appreciate you engaging. It looks like we may have one more question. Could you put together these questions and answers into a document and place it on your website? Yes, will do. And in fact, if I can be super on top of it today, I'll try and do that before I send the link to the recording out with the slide deck, so that we can have all of that information together. So yes, thank you for requesting. All right, everyone, thank you so much. I appreciate your presence here, and I will be thinking about you. Best wishes, and don't hesitate to let me know how I can support you. Thank you.